days yesterday, whether you were with us or not. Today, I have the very great pleasure of introducing my friend and co-author, Joanne Samuel Goldblum. Joanne was a social worker working with families in very deep poverty, families that had experienced chronic homelessness. And she noticed that one of the things that was holding them back was that they couldn't get basic needs like toilet paper and diapers, and that there were no government programs to supply them. So Joanne started a nonprofit to do exactly that. We came to work together in a bunch of ways, but the book happened when Joanne got tired of hearing people blamed for their poverty and really wanted to reframe poverty as a lack of basic needs. And that's what we've done together. So it is my very great pleasure to introduce my friend, thinker and doer, Joanne Goldblum.
Thank you, Colleen. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Colleen Shaddox. And the thing that I am always most appreciative of Colleen for is she is the person that I know who lives her faith in every way. She fights for justice. She fights for those who need support. And when I wanted to write this book, I knew that I had to write it with Colleen, because as much as she says that the idea came from me, it's really an idea that we share. And I think it's why we were able to write this together. And Colleen is a journalist. She has spent her career writing about and thinking about and learning and teaching about injustice in the United States and how to change that. And she does that always from the perspective of her faith. So I am incredibly honored to introduce Colleen and to have the opportunity to work with Colleen so closely.
Thank you, Joanne. So just some housekeeping on how things are going to go this afternoon. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know what your pronouns are, where you live, what your faith tradition is, or anything else you might like us to know. The first half of the program will be me and Joanne talking at you. And then we're going to do a project. We are going to take some time out to frame a social justice issue within the context of our faith, as I hope Joanne and I are going to effectively model right now. So there's 4 parts to our presentation. We're going to start out talking about the way we frame poverty. Then I'm going to come on and talk a little bit about how people are persuaded and the role of values in persuasion. And then we're each going to model talking about a poverty issue from our own faith tradition. For me, that's Roman Catholic, and for Joanne, that's Jewish. And Joanne's going to start right now. Oh, one more thing. We have a hard stop at 3:15. So there's going to be more sharing and more learning that we want to do. We have our contact information at the end of this. You are very welcome to get in contact with us yourself to continue the discussion, but we have to be out of the Zoom room at 3:15. Okay, Joanne.
Thanks, Colleen. I'm really excited to be here because I think that what Colleen and I have focused on in our book and in our work really is in large part related to democratic socialism and the fact that we believe everybody deserves to have their basic needs met. So our strategy for ending poverty in the United States, I want to start by talking about the issue of diaper need and the National Diaper Bank Network. As Colleen said, I'm a social worker, and I was a long time ago working at Yale Child Study Center and doing community-based social work. And we're in New Haven, so it is a small industrial, post-industrial city in the Northeast. And what I saw over and over again was a level of poverty that, even as somebody who felt that they understood what poverty was like in the United States, I was shocked by what I saw when I went into people's homes. And again, as a clinician, I was being sent to support families and to help them, but I wasn't able to help them with the concrete things that they needed. And basically, what I came to over time was the idea that I can't teach someone to diaper their baby if they don't have a clean diaper. And the example of toilet paper, you know, there is no clinical intervention, no matter how skilled a clinician I am or how good a social worker I might be. If a family doesn't have toilet paper, there is no clinical intervention I can perform outside of giving them what they need. And so I really became obsessed with the idea that our system was backwards, and that in fact, education is not always the way out of poverty. And so, I started the New Haven Diaper Bank, which is now the Diaper Bank of Connecticut. And through that, was able to begin to give product to people who needed it. And at the same time, work to change policy. But what I knew was I couldn't change policy if I didn't also meet the needs of the people I was trying to support. Because I think that often there's this discrepancy, and people, organizations, policymakers feel like you either change policy or give people the things that they need. And I felt strongly that we really needed to look at this as a twofold issue. Um, and really, the beginning of what Colleen and I want to talk about is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that sometimes poverty is the problem. You know, that in fact, not having money is the problem, not the idea that people are poor because they are somehow deficient. Um, you know, it's hard, but when you look at the pyramid, you see that as a society, we tend to look at the things towards the top of the pyramid, not at the bottom. And that in fact, our view of addressing poverty is a little bit backwards. So we really believe that we need to address the lack of money that people in poverty experience. So why did I begin by focusing on diapers? Because diapers are a basic need for all children. And there's no federal subsidy to support diapers or any other hygiene product, cleaning supply, anything like that. And, you know, as a society, our policymakers tend to think about the high level issues. So we might support childcare, and let's all be clear that we don't support it enough. But even in supporting it, we don't think about, well, what about diapers? What about formula? What about transportation? And the same goes with housing. We might think about providing a subsidy for rent, but when we help a homeless family, move into a new apartment, we don't think about beds, sheets, pots, pans, the things you need to make a house a home. And so we really want to talk about our book and how we went from an idea to a plan, how we went from praxis to message. The book is Broken America, Seeing, Understanding, and Ending U.S. Poverty. And Colleen and I are really proud of the book. It is the result of, over 3 years of research. And we interviewed people from across the country. We were very committed to the idea that this is not a story of one family or a story of one community. This is a story of the United States and how we address poverty. And, to talk a little bit about the issue of diaper need, people don't not change their baby when it's necessary because they're bad parents. Generally, it's because they can't afford it. And the same goes for other basic needs. The gap between what US Americans make and what they need to meet their necessities is just too broad. And the government historically is hesitant to supply people with money because it believes it creates dependency. And so, what we want to talk about is the fact that we believe that's not the case. It actually, poverty stems from a lack of resources. This number, and the reason we think it's so important that a full 38% of US Americans have difficulty consistently meeting their basic needs, is because that's a pre-COVID number. And the fact that that number includes primarily people who are employed. US workers have been losing ground in terms of salary since the 70s. And what we wanted to talk about is the fact that most of the time in the United States, working is not a way out of poverty. And because of the way that the media focuses on policy, we think that most US Americans who don't think about poverty on a day-to-day basis believe that it actually is an issue of personal failure, really, not to be able to meet all of your needs. So, in the book, we talk about a lot of different areas. The first of which is housing, right? We hear about it all the time, and US Americans struggle to stay housed. And that is because wages have not kept up with housing costs. And one of the things that we think is really important is that people talk about the fact that you shouldn't pay more than 30% of your income on housing. But we know that for many, many people, that's just not possible. And in fact, one of the things that I'm going to read this because I think it's fascinating. In New York City, Medicaid, which has lots of different rules, over time has increased the level at which they consider housing to be a reasonable percentage of a household's income. This is for eligibility for Medicaid. So the 30% rule from a long time ago became 50%, and now it's 70%, right? It is not possible for someone to support themselves paying 70% of their income on housing. But we've come to believe that that is accessible or acceptable. So the other issue, some of the other issues is transportation, right? And what we know is that the cheapest options for housing tend to have the poorest access to transportation. And as I said, we spoke to people across the country, and one group of people, we were in Newark, Ohio, at a poverty think tank of people in poverty. It's an amazing organization. And there was a new Amazon warehouse that was opening close to Newark, Ohio. most of the people we spoke to were not able to even apply for these jobs because there was no public transportation. So, this idea that jobs are available is really sometimes not accurate because if you can't get to the job, it isn't really available to you. And we also found, and I know this won't surprise any of you, that for in people in poverty, and particularly people of color, are commonly arrested for fare evasion. And this includes children who have to take public transportation to school. And one thing that, sort of from a policy standpoint, that I had not thought about until we wrote this book is the fact that even when children are given free transportation, free access to public transportation for school, their parents aren't. So we're setting families up not to be able to access the things that they really need. Water. So many of us hear about water and we think, well, that's a third world problem. That is a developing country problem. It's not. It's a problem here in the United States too. Most of you know that it's a problem in Flint, right? We've been hearing about that. But what we found is that Flint is just the tip of the iceberg. We interviewed a man in Baltimore who spends $20 a week on bottled water just to flush his toilet. His city water was turned off for non-payment and put a lien on his house for a $700 unpaid water bill. And what was particularly interesting about this, and also not at all unusual, is that it was probably a mistake, a problem with the way that the water was being billed. But he wasn't able to find anybody who was able to help him. He was on the verge of homelessness because of a broken water meter. And it's completely legal. And I think that that is a lot of what we focused on in this book, is really looking at these things that so many of us don't think about. That in the United States, in a city like Baltimore, someone is buying water, bottled water, to flush their toilet. I think that again, this, is so obvious when you start to look at the numbers. The cost of living, right, the poverty standard is an antiquated system, and it vastly underestimates how many people live in poverty in the United States. And one of the ways we know that is because many of the anti-poverty programs that are administered by our state and federal governments allow people living at up to 200% of poverty to access these programs, which means that we recognize that you can still be poor, you can still need support, and have twice the income of the federal poverty level. And this slide gives you an example of, a median rent for a 2-bedroom apartment is just about $1,200 a year. And over the course of a year, that would be over 2/3 of the federal poverty guideline for a family of 3. It's not conceivable that anybody could live on just that. And the thesis of our book is incredibly basic. These systems exist to preserve inequality. And we have 2 options: increase the amount of money people have, or decrease the price of the things they need. Those are the only options. And so, given that, we know that we really need to change the way that US Americans think about poverty. And so this is, as we said before, the federal poverty level for a family of three is below $21,720 a year. It is not possible to live on that in the United States, and there's lots and lots of research to back that up. You know, talking about sort of the federal programs that lift people out of poverty, we found this to be a fascinating slide because what it shows you is that it's the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit that has lifted the most people out of poverty, which of course is why we're so excited about the implementation of Rosa DeLauro's um, fully refundable tax credit, because it will lift so many more people out of poverty. But what's interesting is you look at that and it's so many people. Look at SNAP, food stamps, rental assistance, SSI, the numbers are so much smaller. And TANF, temporary assistance for needy families, is the program that is supposed to support families who experience poverty. And you can see it lifts less than 1 million people out of poverty annually. So that's a really important thing to know. You hear people talk about these different programs, but what do they really do and how much do they really help people? 1 in 5 US children live in poverty, you know, more than adults. But think about the fact that 1 in 5, and if you add low income, which is generally defined as twice the federal poverty level, 44% of all children are poor or low income in the United States. That should be shameful to us. Yet it is so widely accepted, and we blame parents for that. You know, you heard I run the National Diaper Bank Network. I've worked in, issues related to children in poverty and families in poverty my whole adult life. And what I hear over and over again is, well, people shouldn't have kids if they can't afford them. And I think that's really something we have to think about as a society, that is our response to childhood poverty. It is not to show compassion or to show justice or to show charity. It is to show judgment. And of course, what are we really doing with the programs that we do have to support families? Are we subsidizing families or are we subsidizing corporations? And, Colleen and I would say that we're subsidizing corporations. Most people on public assistance work. So if they're working and their wages don't allow them to meet their basic needs and they need to get support from the government, it is a subsidy to the corporation to allow them to pay substandard wages. Because in fact, what we're doing is augmenting minimum wage and low wage work. And the fact that CEO pay rose 970% between 1978, while worker wage rose only 12%. What does that tell us? It tells us that we value corporations considerably more than we value individuals. And, not for nothing, healthcare costs rose 101%. How do we expect workers to support themselves and their families? The math does not work. And so we have to find a way to change that. You know, and so, how do you become self-sufficient without money? And the answer is it isn't possible. And that's why the way that our federal programs, federal support for families and individuals who experience poverty is really so backwards. We talk about moving people towards self sufficiency. One of the things we talk about in our book is the fact that so often these welfare to work or workforce programs train people for low wage work. So while it is true that they do not need to receive or are not able to receive um, public assistance once they are making a certain amount of money, they're not making enough to truly be self sufficient. And, we really want to, you know, get people on board with the idea that poverty is not gravity. It's not a law of nature. We can change it, and it is within our power to do that. We just have to decide that it is the most important thing. And I think we're seeing a lot of that right now with what is being implemented by the Biden Harris administration. We are seeing that there is a recognition that we can end poverty in the United States. And so, our idea and what we want to talk about is that we don't need to fix people. We need to eliminate poverty. And those are two very different things. And my friend Colleen is going to talk about how we need to use messaging to persuade people in this area.
Thank you. So you are all enlightened people, and I bet you accept most of what Joanne just said. But the rest of the world isn't quite as enlightened as this group, right? So we need to figure out how to talk to people who aren't naturally allied with us. The picture before you is Guy Fieri with his bacon, cheese, mac and cheese, and onion rings burger. This man has a career in the United States, a country with an obesity epidemic, where we all know what foods are good and not good for us, right? And if we just acted on information alone, we'd all be living on broccoli and tofu. We wouldn't eat this stuff, but we do eat it because information alone does not convince human beings to do things. And people in public health have recognized this for a long time, that you need to actually provide some sort of motivation that works with the person's life. But those of us who are trying to change things in the policy arena, we're not quite there yet. And one thing that Joanne and I are really trying to do is find a way to talk to people who do not naturally agree with us. Next slide, please. So, okay, information alone does not change behavior. And we like information. And by we, I mean progressives, right? We're really well read. Like we can cite chapter or verse of an article that we read in The Nation 3 years ago. And I know this because I come from a family of very conservative Republicans, and I have been winning arguments with them for half a century, but none of them know it. They all think that they've won these arguments because my silly facts just kind of wash over them on the best days. But on the worst days, it actually makes them defensive because our values are who we are. I mean, as sure as our physical bodies, right? I am the things that I believe. And if you start challenging my progressive values, my reaction is become defensive to you. And so I stop listening. And all of that information that's washing over me, it's not going to help. It's actually just going to make me build up higher walls. So it's counterproductive. Another thing we have to consider is that conservatives don't like data as much as we do. They really like anecdotes. You can cite statistics day and night to a conservative, and they will say, but I was in the grocery store the other day, and there was this woman using food stamps, and it's all gone. It's all gone. All of reality doesn't exist because of this one woman they met in a grocery store and probably made a racist assumption about. So that's not the way to talk to people, to just pile on the data. Next slide, please. Now let's look at who we really are, right? On the outer edge is information, what I know. So I know a lot about Shakespeare and jazz and baseball. So if you know a lot about Shakespeare and jazz and baseball, we could probably sit down and have a cup of tea together and have a very pleasant conversation. But that's not really that deep, right? It doesn't really tell you who we are. It doesn't really tell you if we're going to have a long-term friendship or not. It just tells you that we have these common areas. You move in closer to the self when you start talking about experience. I worked for a long time as a waitress when I was in school, and I have many diner horror stories. If you worked in a diner and also had diner horror stories, we could sit down to talk together and we would develop some kind of empathy. So we'd have a closer bond. We would have an even closer bond if we had common interests. So I live in East Haddam, Connecticut, and I do not want a trash to energy plant going in nearby because I'm afraid of what it might do to my well water. All of my neighbors who may not agree with me on other things probably agree on that, and we can work together on that very effectively. And that's very often a way that you can get conservatives to work with you. I've done a lot of work on juvenile justice system reform, and we could tend to get very conservative folks to work with us because the idea of locking kids up for minor nonviolent offenses really resonated with them because they knew that was a waste of government money and it was government overreach and it was raising their taxes. So we got Republicans to vote for pretty lefty bills by using that approach. But the most persuasive place is right at your center, and that is your values. Now, we all come from faith traditions that have very specific values. And I believe that any progressive thing we want to do can be shaped to fit with the values of our faith tradition. And it's a way of talking with people that I think is really underused. I think one of the reasons that all of us who planned this conference were so excited about having it was that I feel that faith has really been given over to the right wing in this country, very, very much. And when I hear people who come from my faith tradition talk about kicking out immigrants or not giving people a living wage, I just think, we're reading the same scriptures. Like, how do you get there? So what I want to talk about today are strategies for taking our progressive values, fitting them into the values of our faith tradition, and thereby getting some more people on board who really should have been on board all along. Next slide, please. So where do values come from? And you can flip right over that. I really like that image very much. We have two sources of values, at least two sources of values in this country, I would say. We have this nationalism that has really made capitalism almost a religion. There's a wonderful book out now, The Enchantments of Mammon, that we're actually going to have a podcast coming up on our site with the author that I highly recommend. And he talks about the way that capitalism has almost become a religion in many societies. And you can certainly see that in the United States, where hard work is this tremendous virtue. I grew up thinking that. I don't think that anymore. I think that there are other things I can do with my human life other than, serve this capitalistic system. But we were really, that's been inbred in us. And so if capitalism is your religion and you see this person in poverty, that's kind of a sin, isn't it? And I would say that that's at odds with the values of every major faith, which puts human beings before systems and before material goods. So I think we need to fight back against this sort of false, xenophobic, materialistic national religion we've got with true religion. And those are the 5 symbols that I found on a quick search. I know that doesn't represent everybody, and I'm eager to hear about other people's takes on this as we go forward. Next slide, please. Is this me or you?
You.
Oh, okay.
I think.
Okay. I already spoke about this, really, that the values are colliding, and we really see this in the kind of the anecdotes. And remember, we said that conservatives like anecdotes a lot more than we do. The welfare queen. And Ronald Reagan is given credit for this horrible statement. Actually, my father was using it years before Ronald Reagan, so I had a lot of experience with it. You take this one person and you make her really evil because she's defied the national religion. But if you look at our own religions, our true religions, they don't allow you to look at human beings like that. They don't allow you to look at human beings as failures because they're not serving your economic system. Next slide, please. So here is an example of how we might use our faith tradition to incorporate the things that we believe as progressives. And I would say, for me at least, the politics spring from the religion, not the other way around. So it feels actually quite natural to me to do this. So this is from John 17. Jesus encounters a man who was blind for birth, and people say, "Rabbi, who sinned? Was it this man or his parents that he was born blind?" And Jesus said, "Neither of them sinned. This is so that the works of God may be displayed in him. While I am the world, I am the light of the world." So not only is it not the man's fault, it is Jesus's role, and therefore the role of me as someone who worships and believes in him, to try and relieve the suffering of others, right? And he spit on the ground, made some mud, put it in the man's eyes, and cleansed him and made him whole. So it's my work on earth to make people whole, not to ask why they are not whole. And I think that that's really useful for me when I'm talking to fellow Christians about this idea that people are to blame for their misfortune. It's not uncommon in this world. I mean, you look all the way back to the book of Job, right? All Job's friends come around and say to him, how did you offend God? Apologize to God. Stop screwing up. Job didn't offend God. He had really bad luck when he was the target of a bet between God and the devil. And the Bible really shows us over and over again that suffering is not a personal failing. And I think it's so important for those of us who are Christians to use that background when we talk to our brothers and sisters of the same faith about why poverty is not a personal failing. Next slide, please. And, it goes to so many other things. We have this whole idea about the deserving poor. You have to take a drug test. You have to be looking for a job. You have to do this. You have to do that. When somebody's hungry, you feed them. That's what every word of the Gospels tells me. And I just don't think you can deny that. Next slide, please.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we think about this and frame this from a Jewish perspective. For just so people know, I grew up as a Reformed Jew. I still see myself as that, though I do go to what would be considered a conservadox synagogue with my family. So that's sort of where I come to this from. And basically, there are four really important aspects to the Jewish beliefs about supporting those around us. And I'm going to talk about them. There are different words. I'm going to just share two of them, but I am not going to use any Hebrew words while I'm speaking, except to describe. You really hear about two different things. Tikkun olam, which generally translates as repairing the world, and tzedakah, which translates to righteousness and generally refers to the Jewish idea of charity. So to start, of the really important areas, the first is justice. And the reason justice is so important, I have on these slides just some different examples that you'll see, but I'll describe them rather than reading them. First off, in the Bible, justice is repeated time and time again. And that's unusual. It's repeated, as you see here in Deuteronomy, justice, justice. That happens very, very infrequently in the Torah. So I think that, we believe that was because the goal was to make it clear that justice in and of itself was incredibly important. Also, we are told again and again to pursue justice, not wait for the right opportunity, not the right time or the right place, but to pursue it whenever the opportunity presents itself to us. And you can see that in both of these quotes. The second area is giving to charity. And, we believe that it is the highest form of charity, of support, to prevent a person from becoming poor. And the highest form is to provide a loan, a gift, or a job that he or she would have that would allow him to adequately support himself. And that's what's so important. We've, as a society, taken this idea that the most important thing is to provide them provide people with the ability to support themselves. But we've left aside that it is equally as important that they are able to support themselves adequately. So, I think that is a very, very important thing for us to keep in mind. And then the area of compassion. That is what we are told to do, that is our place in the world, to promote compassion. And it's considered that, the entire Torah is designed to teach us to be compassionate. In fact, the Birkot Hamazon, which is the grace that's recited after meals in traditional Judaism, speaks of God feeding the whole world with compassion. And what's so interesting about that is it's a combination. God both feeds people with the food that they need, but also with compassion, because it is, according to our beliefs, compassion
Joanne, please unmute yourself. I was letting someone in and muted you.
No problem. Thanks. So several indications in the Jewish tradition that God sides with the poor and the oppressed, and he intervened in Egypt to, allow the Jews as slaves to, break the yoke of slavery. And the prophets constantly castigated those who oppressed the needy. So really, we heard over and over, he who oppresses a poor man insults his neighbor. So helping a needy person is like providing a loan to the creator of the universe. So when Jews choose to say, well, if they worked harder, they would have what they needed, or they somehow deserve to be poor because of their own, because of things that they do not have, because they are lacking, we are not doing what God has asked us to do. And then the last area is sharing. And the sage Hillel stresses that we must not be concerned only with our own welfare. We must be concerned as much with those around us as we are with ourselves. And I think that those are really the areas that as Jews, we can look to and we can use to explain to others of our own faith community that supporting those in need is in fact what we believe we're encouraged to do through our teachings and readings. So Colleen, I'll give it back to you.
Yes. So what we would like you to do now is what we just did. We would like you to take 10 minutes and come up with a strategy, a talking point, or a strategy you've used in the past that you'd like to abandon now about using your faith tradition to advance your progressive politics. And we are going to come back at 3:01 and share really, really, really briefly.
Thanks, Colleen.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And if during this time, I guess it's safe to say, Colleen and I are here. So if people have questions or thoughts as you're doing this, feel free to write them in the chat. And we can certainly comment.